I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'd like to give a special thanks to Peter Drummy, who put together a really wonderful display in the other room, and I hope you had a chance to look at it. It had material that we hold in our collections related to Benjamin Butler. Many of the items are quite unique. They include a chamber pot with Benjamin Butler's face, a commemorative spoon given to him by his own soldiers, and Butler's death mask. Based on a survey of MHS staff, we believe that this is actually the first time that has ever been exhibited at MHS. So I personally have to say that I find it a little creepy, but it's quite unique. We have a great program this evening in which we'll hear about one of the most important and controversial military and political leaders of the Civil War. Benjamin Franklin Butler was known for his uncompromising administration of the federal occupation of New Orleans during the Civil War. However, he was also a general in the Union Army and later went on to be a member of Congress and the governor of Massachusetts. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Elizabeth Leonard. She teaches at Colby College in Maine, and her research focuses on the Civil War and women's history. She's published 5 earlier books on the Civil War, including Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt of Kentucky, which was the winner of the Lincoln Prize. She'll be joined in conversation by Dr. Kanasorn Wangshri Shanalai, who is the Director of Research at the Massachusetts Historical Society. He has written or edited 4 books on the Civil War, and prior to coming to the MHS, was an associate professor in the Department of History at Angelo State University. For anyone who may be new to Massachusetts Historical Society, we are the first historical society in America. We date back to 1791 and have been an independent organization for the past 230 years. We maintain a research library with an amazing collection of material, which is open to the public for free. We also host a wide variety of programs. We're only able to host programs like these thanks to the support of our members and donors, and we hope that if you enjoy this program, you'll return and you'll consider supporting MHS in its work. So now please join me in turning this over to Elizabeth Leonard and Kanasorn Wangshri Shanalai.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Thank you for everyone joining us in here and out there. Here's the book. And thank you to Dr. Leonard for joining us as well.
My pleasure.
I've known about Benjamin Butler since I was in high school. Well, I took a film class, and one of our assignments was to write a screenplay, create characters and write a screenplay. And the character I created stole spoons. I based that, of course, on one of the stories about Benjamin Butler. He is someone who has all of these strange traits that pop up again and again and again. He's a controversial figure. If you've studied the Civil War, you've probably heard of him. But for a lot of folks, they may never have heard this name. Let's start with the basics. Who was Benjamin Butler?
Who was Benjamin Butler? Such a good question. First of all, thank you to the Massachusetts Historical Society for inviting me, and Kid and Gavin and everyone else. And I do want to say I have a cough drop tucked in my cheek here, and I apologize, but I had a cold last week and I'm trying very hard not to lose my voice. I have a series of talks I have to give, so I apologize. It seems rude to have something tucked in your cheek, but that's why. Benjamin Butler was, in one way to describe him is as Colby College's most important and illustrious Civil War era alumnus, although Colby has not yet discovered that. I'm working on that. He was a lawyer, a Civil War general, a congressman, a governor of Massachusetts, a candidate for president, someone who was very active throughout the period of his life, 1818 to 1893, in so many of the important issues of his day that often I feel astonished that anybody would not know who he is. And I have referred to him, if you know the film Forrest Gump, as Forrest Butler. He just shows up everywhere. So he's a person of great political and other kinds of influence in his day. And it is kind of shocking to me that people don't even know who he is. Although, as you said, if you've studied anything about the Civil War, you've bumped into him there for sure.
So let's talk about his contributions to the American Civil War. He was very important in early on, especially, but actually throughout the entire period. What are some of the highlights of his contributions to the American Civil War?
I think he is one of the first highlights comes very early on, before the war is even really underway in earnest, and that is that he was the general who was able to get troops to Washington to defend the federal capital against expected invasion from the South. He also was absolutely instrumental shortly thereafter in maintaining the loyalty of border state Maryland for the Union, which, if you have studied the war, you would know, of course, that the loss of any of those border states between slavery and freedom would have been potentially catastrophic, certainly would have reshaped the nature of the work the Union had to do. He then went on to Fortress Monroe in Virginia, where he crafted the very first policy under duress, having to deal with the runaways from slavery who were coming to the Union for protection. He then went on later to New Orleans and served as the commander in charge of the occupation forces in New Orleans, which was the first major city that the Union was able to occupy, and really the testing ground for Reconstruction, although it was only 1862. But as soon as the Union occupied Confederate territory, the issues of Reconstruction had to arise. He also was involved heavily in late 1863 and through 1864 with the Army in Virginia, mostly commanding Black soldiers whose advancement he championed without hesitation. And so during the Civil War, he did many important things, many of which have been forgotten, although I think if people remember or know anything about his Civil War work, even if they don't know him deeply, they do know about the contraband policy. That's my experience. People, oh yeah, he's the guy, who refused to return those slaves. Right?
Well, so he's drawing on his legal experience, his legal mind, his shrewd legal mind. He's involved in politics, I think on the local level before the war.
Very much so. Yeah, he had been, his mother, Charlotte, his widowed mother, sent him to Colby College, which was then Waterville College, hoping that he would become a Baptist minister. He was having none of that. Somebody at a talk I gave the other day said, oh, but he was a devout Baptist. And I said, I will take issue with you there, sir. His mother was a devout Baptist who deeply hoped he would become a Baptist minister by going to Baptist Waterville College. He, on the other hand, hated the rules of the college along the religious lines, bought his way out of chapel by paying fines on a regular basis, thought predestination was a stupid idea because why would you do anything, if you can't win your salvation or lose it, who cares what you do? I mean, he was not a devout Baptist, but at college he became interested in science and he became interested in the law. He went on to be a lawyer. He moved back after college and a bit of time at sea where he was building up his strength and drinking a lot of cod liver oil. Went back to Lowell, where he had been raised, and became a lawyer. And his early days as a lawyer were spent fighting for the rights of laborers, particularly the factory workers, and particularly factory working women.
And he's also involved in the local militia, which is how he ends up leading Massachusetts troops early in the war, right?
Right. He was involved in the Massachusetts state militia, which when his mother sent him to Waterville College, the biggest disappointment about it was that he wasn't going to West Point. He had really wanted to go to West Point, and for the first year he was at Waterville, there was some hope that he could be transferred to West Point. That didn't work out. He was disappointed, but when he went back to Massachusetts after college, he joined the Massachusetts Volunteer Militia and got his military experience there, and that he also took into the war.
And that's why he leads Massachusetts troops into Maryland,
Right.
saving the District of Columbia from being surrounded.
Saving the District of Columbia from being surrounded and also holding Maryland
Right.
in the Union. And it was his troops, when you hear about the firing on the troops in Baltimore in April, as they're trying to get to the Capitol, those are Butler's troops who were fired on. And he wasn't there with them. He was still, some of the troops were on their way to Washington early. He had not yet left Boston, but those were his troops.
I love that. I mean, the Contraband story is great. And maybe we should talk a little bit
Sure.
about that for folks who are unfamiliar with it. But I love that he's using his legal mind to apply to this horrible situation, the Civil War. One staff officer who knew Butler commented on his sharp, shrewd, able mind, without conscience or modesty, overbearing, a bad man to have against you in a criminal case.
And Butler would have been the first to say, that is so true. That is so true about me. He is really a study in contradictions, as lovable and infuriating as he could possibly be. But the contraband policy was a very clever, he derived it through very careful, clever thinking around what to do with these three men who had escaped to Fort Monroe and were asking for protection. He visited with them, he talked with them individually, and worked his way through over several hours into this idea that he himself later said, well, I'm not sure it was the best legal principle, but morally it was right, and as a general, it was the right thing to do. And the principle was, if they were slaves from Virginia, and Virginia had seceded, and their owner was not interested in taking an oath of allegiance to the United States, then in fact, those slaves were not subject to the fugitive slave law, right? They could be taken like any other, there was nothing binding him to protect or apply the fugitive slave law to them. If, on the other hand, the owner would come to Fort Monroe and take an oath of allegiance to the United States, he said, well, then I will return them. Although I think he was pretty confident that would not happen, Virginia just having reified its secession. So it was a very clever maneuver about which he felt very proud. And historians have talked about it in a range of different ways. Some have said it really wasn't that important. Some have said he was just being manipulative for his own benefit. But I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit. And certainly people in his day, people like Frederick Douglass and others who were watching everything that the federal government was doing, was thinking about doing, might possibly consider doing with regard to the escaped slaves, he was thrilled. People were thrilled with what he had done. And the federal government, the agents that he went to, Lincoln and Simon Cameron in the War Department, asking, what exactly do you want me to do under these circumstances? All sort of said, well, I don't know, go ahead, do what you're doing. I mean, the federal government had not yet crafted its own policy. After he crafts this contraband policy, and now hundreds of slaves, of course, start coming to Fortress Monroe, it pushes Congress to do what Congress is going to do. It pushes the project of emancipation forward. So it's an extremely important moment. And if you haven't had the chance to see, has anybody had the chance to see the play, Ben Butler? Have you seen that?
I didn't know
It's
there
a
was a play.
wonderful play by Richard Strand that was making the rounds of small theaters, including up in Portland, out in California. It's specifically about this moment of Butler's decision-making. And it takes some license with the story. It boils the three slaves down to one guy, which is kind of interesting, but I can understand the dramatic purpose of that. But it's a wonderful I think 2 or 3 act, maybe 2-act study of this process of him working through this with a tremendous amount of humor in it. And actually, I think Butler would have loved the play himself. He would have loved the depiction of himself in the play.
Well, so the moment at Fort Monroe where he crafts his contraband policy is an important one for American political and military history.
Yes.
But it seems like a turning point for Ben Butler too. Prior to the war, he had not really been a champion of African Americans, and afterwards it seems like he is their greatest ally.
Well, I would probably add a little nuance there. It certainly is a transformative moment for him. Prior to the war, I think when Butler looking back on his life, when he wrote his massive autobiography in 1891, it came out in 1892, he looked back and said, among other things, I was always the champion of the underdog. And I think that's true, but his sense of who the underdogs were changed over time. And in his early life prior to the war, the underdogs were the poor working people, laboring classes, factory laborers, and so on, and women, actually. I think his experience at Fort Monroe was a major step, and with those enslaved men, a major step in expanding that group of who the underdogs of American society really are. But it wasn't so simple yet for him because the war itself remained so complicated around these issues. And for example, when he goes to New Orleans later, of course, enslaved people start running away when they know the Union Army is there too. But now there's the issue of Reconstruction. And what do you do if they're running away from white owners who might actually be successfully reconstructed? And the Emancipation Proclamation hasn't yet been issued. And so he's growing, he's changing, he's expanding his views, but the war itself is still very complicated. And so some people will look back and say, well, he was so ready to emancipate those, or at least take those slaves in Fort Monroe as contraband. Why didn't he do the same thing immediately everywhere else he went? And it's because the conditions were so different.
Well, he also is the commander of African-American soldiers on
Yes.
the battlefield, as the commander of the Army of the James.
Yes.
And it seems like when he sees the sacrifices they've made, that also pushes
I would
him
say
in their
that's
corner.
where the final,
That's
it's
the-
over for, it's like, never mind. And this is where he uses that language. I'll cut off my left hand before I will allow these men not to have the rights that white men have.
Because they have sacrificed
What
for the
they've
United States.
sacrificed with so little potential for gain. He says to his wife, maybe you have the.
I do.
Yeah.
Poor fellows, he reflected. They seem to have so little to fight for in this context, with the weight of prejudice loaded upon them, their lives given to a country which has given them not yet justice, not to say fostering care. There is one boon they love to fight for, freedom for themselves and their race forever.
Right. And that's where I think, the die was cast for him finally. He had been growing. And I think one of the important themes of this book is, in fact, his development. There are certain ways in which Butler was the same person from beginning to end. And there are ways in which you really see him develop and grow and change, which is one of the very hopeful things I think about the book. Actually, it gives me hope that we can all develop and change and not always be quite the same and so narrow-minded. But anyway, yeah.
I think we have to talk about New Orleans.
Okay.
That's for folks
That
who,
old saw.
for folks who do not know, the chamber pot that Gavin alluded to with Butler's portrait in it is from his time as military governor of New Orleans. Would you
Yes,
like
indeed.
to tell us about his administration of the Crescent
Sure.
City?
So Butler was the commander of the occupation forces in New Orleans from late April of 1862 until the middle of December of 1862, quite a long stretch of time. And when he arrived, the city was in utter chaos. It was a very rebellious city. It was a very complicated commercial environment with a lot of international actors there as well because of international commerce. And so on. Very rebellious, a lot of rebellious she-rebels as well as he-rebels. And it was a very difficult situation. And he laid down the hammer, so to speak. Early on, he saw to the execution of William Mumford, which is the original source, I believe, of his reputation as a beast. William Mumford, a local Confederate supporter, had torn down the flag from the United States Mint and dragged it through the streets, the US flag, and Butler decided to have a military commission which found him guilty of treason, and he was executed. And this was seen as a shocking and terrible act by some people. By others, it was like, what did you expect exactly when you tore down the flag and dragged it through the street? The work that he faced in New Orleans was not just the work of suppressing the rebellion, but the work of protecting the city from yellow fever, reorganizing commercial relations, feeding the poor who had sacrificed so much for the benefit of the wealthy of the town, and keeping the town in check, and also sort of laying the foundation or toying with the possible ideas of what Reconstruction would look like. Mm-hmm. You know, this is, as I said, a kind of testing ground for what's going to come later. So he was a very stern commander in New Orleans towards white Confederate leaders especially, but he also did save the city from yellow fever. He did put a lot of people to work who had not been able to work before, or who were poor and needed labor to survive. He fed whites and blacks alike, and he was beloved by many people in New Orleans. He was replaced in December by Nathaniel Banks, and it was not long before people were yearning for his return. Please send Mr. Butler back. He knew what he was doing. He kept the city in order, and so on. It was also in New Orleans that he initiated a practice of starting to turn Black men into soldiers for the Union, because he took the Louisiana Native Guard and made them US soldiers. They were happy to do it, of course. They really didn't quite fit well with the idea of defending Louisiana, defending the Confederacy. They were happy to turn their service over to the United States, and that was kind of a prototype program, in fact, for the United States colored troops.
Right. So he's governing a multiracial city in the midst of a civil war. He's going to
far from the center of power.
Absolutely. And it's the largest city in the Confederacy, New Orleans was at the time. He has a huge task, so he's going to have supporters.
Right.
But he also had many detractors.
Many detractors.
Throughout the Confederacy. There's a reason they call him Beast Butler, and why his face is in a chamber pot.
Well, there is the William Mumford story, of course, and I want to note, and I talk about this in the book, it's important to note that after the war, Butler went on to have contact with Mumford's widow and support her throughout much of the rest of her life, helping her to find jobs in the federal government and sending her money and so on. But he also issued his woman order, which is perhaps what you were thinking of, which added to this new layer of what a beast he is. The woman order was issued against Confederate women, white women who were treating his soldiers badly, dumping their chamber pots on his head. They said wearing the bones of dead Union soldiers around their necks as jewelry, turning away from soldiers, getting off trolley cars when the soldiers got on, the Union soldiers got on, stepping off the curb into the dust when the soldiers were passing by, moving away from them in church, God forbid, no pun intended, and so on. So he felt that this disrespect towards his soldiers was unacceptable, and it represented a kind of Confederate sentiment by women that needed to be addressed, that they should not be exempt from punishment for this unacceptable treatment of his occupying forces. So he issued this order that basically said, if you continue to do that, I'll throw you into jail as a prostitute. That's not the exact wording, but that was how it was read. And it was very effective, in fact. But it managed to suppress most of the women's bad behavior, but it also enraged many white men in the South and white men across the world, in fact. I mean, as news got out, it was so shocking that the ladyhood, these Southern women's gentility was being challenged in this way. And again, I feel like, well, I can understand since, in the values of the day, why that would be shocking. But again, thinking of the conditions he was under, he had certain goals, and it didn't matter if you were a woman or a man. And as he himself said, once I issued the order, basically the behavior stopped. So, it's not exactly true, but a lot of it stopped.
And here's evidence of his effectiveness in suppressing this unruly population. I did not know this, but in 1864, in probably the most rowdy city in the North, New York City.
Right.
What does the Lincoln
Butler
administration
Gump,
do?
there he is again.
That's right.
Yeah, he sends Butler to control the population in New York.
Yeah, so ensure
during the election,
a fair, free election.
Yeah, to ensure the fair. And New Yorkers were thrilled that Butler, because what people knew about Butler was he knew how to control ill-behaved people, or that was part of his reputation. So yeah, he was sent to New York to make sure that the election was fair and free in New York City, and especially in the shadow of the New York City draft riots of the year before.
Okay.
Butler Gump, Forrest Butler.
And he's touching on so many issues.
Everywhere.
Epidemics.
Yeah.
Race riots.
And this is just the war period.
That's right.
He lived 75 years.
He did. Okay. He's a good administrator. You've not talked about him as a military leader.
Right. Yes. And I have had a discussion with numerous people about how to describe him as a military commander in the field. I would choose the word substandard, perhaps, or inadequate, inferior. It wasn't his strength, that's for sure. And he had some good successes at Cape Hatteras in North Carolina. Later, at Chaffin's Farm, you could say that was kind of a success. He's famous for being bottled up Butler at Bermuda 100 during the Overland Campaign, and campaign for Virginia and so on in 1864. That was not his strength. It certainly was something he yearned to be very successful at. But he was a brilliant administrator. And I think that's part of the dilemma for people like Lincoln, what to do with this person who is such a good administrator and not so good in the field. But the war was not just a matter of who won which battle. And battles weren't won only by the commanders in the field. And I also think it's important to me, one of the issues that arises around Butler in this question and in others is, why is that something if you know anything about Butler, he was not so great as a field commander, but you don't know that he defended free and fair elections in New York. And you know that he wasn't a great field commander, maybe, but I just noticed as I was walking past the State House that there's a hooker entrance to the State House. And I was thinking, well, can we talk about Chancellorsville? Or can we talk about, there were a lot of commanders who screwed up on a regular, West Pointers, political generals, whatever. So it's not to defend Butler's performance in the field as much as to say, why is that what you remember? Or what we remember? Why is that what comes down to us and then these other things don't?
Can we therefore blame Civil War historians for perpetuating this?
Everyone but me.
Well, no, you really have
No.
redeemed him in many ways and given a lot of nuance to this very complicated character. But again, if anyone's ever encountered him, it's usually in the context of the American Civil War. And he is often the punching bag of the Civil War. One Civil War historian calls him this self-important but nearly useless general, right? And historians love to quote from people who hated Butler
Right.
in the Civil War era. So quotations like a staff officer who met him in 1864 described Butler as the strangest sight on a horse you ever saw, with his stout, shapeless body, his very squinting eyes, and a set of arms and legs that look as if made for somebody else and hastily glued to him by mistake. I mean, they just love pointing this out.
They do.
So it's Civil War historians.
Well, it's some contemporaries, of course,
Right.
you know, and if you look at the illustrated magazines of throughout his life, but, you know, particularly later in his life, there's an enormous amount of mockery
Right.
that is present there. But I think that certain things really fed into that desire to make fun of him.
Mhm.
One thing was, I mean, I spent many years at Colby being jealous of my Bowdoin friends because they had Joshua Chamberlain. And he's so dashing, and he was a professor, and, you know, he was so upstanding, and he taught moral philosophy, for crying out. You know, he was very dashing. And Butler was 5'4" and rather rotund and had the droopy eyes, and he was a sort of curious looking person. But, you know, that fed into the mockery that he experienced, for sure. His personality too, he was very grating, I think, on a lot of people. But I think there's also, so he was an easy target, I suppose, in many ways. But he also both cared and didn't care about how people saw him, and he fed into it himself. And I think in the post-war period and even into the 21st century, historians have, well, early on, in the early 20th century, I would say that the lost cause historians really captured the narrative. And of course, you wouldn't say nice things about Butler if you were going to defend the lost cause. I think they were abetted by other historians who followed the line of thinking of Northern powerful people who also didn't like Butler, mostly for his post-war policies. So I think there's a combination of people who sort of collaborated to dismiss him. I also think Butler's post-war life, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is spent trying so hard to, as I often say, stick the landing of Union victory, make the Union victory have lasting transformative meaning. And Reconstruction really fails on that front in so many ways. And Butler hangs on bitterly to the end. But if you speak fondly of Butler, you have to acknowledge that he was an exception during that period. And you have to confront the way the North failed, in addition to the way the South, rose again. And I think that's hard so it's easier to just mock him. And somebody said, well, people didn't mock Thaddeus Stevens, who Butler was often compared to. But Thaddeus Stevens died in 1868, and Butler lived on to 1893. And I think that makes a difference. And if that makes no sense, please ask me and I'll explain it. But I think that, Thaddeus Stevens died so you can sort of remember him as part of the radical Republicans, and he tried, and oh, well, it didn't work out. Butler's out there to the end going, no, don't do it that way. And pointing the finger at people in the South and the North who are not doing their job to protect the freed people and make the Union victory stick. So it's easier to make him into a laughingstock,
I mean, it certainly is. I think you even pinpoint at a point during the war that early on, people are all for his strong hand in Maryland and all that. And then the perception switches. Does it have to do with his championing of freed people during the war and after?
It certainly, for many people, would not have helped. And maybe especially afterward. I mean, even people who believed in emancipation, even whites who believed in emancipation, didn't necessarily believe in equal rights. Right. And he did.
Yeah.
And so he was pushing towards true equality for Black Americans, and I guess I would say Black men, but given his support for suffrage, I think he probably would have said Black women should also have the right to vote. I don't think he would have said, but only white women should have the right to vote. I mean, he was a suffragist as well. So I think that he really held on to these ideas and pushed them farther than a lot of white Northerners were really interested in seeing them go. And of course, white Southerners.
Well, so he's supportive of freed people's rights. He's supportive of voting rights. He's supportive of suffragettes and their campaign. Let's talk a little bit about that. He has, and you highlight some of the very strong female characters who influenced him. His wife, Sarah, is a great champion, calls him the foremost man of the times.
She loves him so.
Tell us about the women in Ben Butler's life and how they shaped him.
Well, you'd have to start with his mother, Charlotte, to whom he gave most credit for having shaped him. Her strength, he never even met his father because his father died of yellow fever out on the seas before Butler was born. And his mother spent, all of his youth trying to hold the family together and laboring hard to make that possible and make sure that her son could get the best education she could afford him and so on. So his mother was a very strong figure. His grandmother was also a very strong figure for him, also extremely tall, apparently. He was 5'4". His grandmother, he said, was about 6 feet tall in her stocking feet and very imposing. And someone who not only was very well-read and a descendant of Revolutionary War figures, but someone who believed strongly in democracy and equality and taught him about those things as well. So he had those women. He had a sister also named Charlotte, who died quite young, and I think she died in childbirth. It's not entirely clear, but I'm pretty sure based on the archival evidence, she died in childbirth, which would have been very hard for him. He loved his sister Charlotte, and one of the highest compliments he ever paid his new wife was to say, "You are as wonderful as my sister Charlotte." So he had her. So he was the kind of person who was surrounded early on in his life, and the factory workers, all of those factory workers who he ate meals with. His mother was a boarding house keeper. These factory women were there sitting around the table all the time, and he was listening to their stories and listening to their travails. So he was very influenced by them. So he became someone who not only was impressed by these strong women, but then able to support strong women and raise strong women. And his daughter Blanche is a wonderful example of a strong woman that he was happy to raise to be strong. And I was talking to someone earlier this evening about how when he and Blanche communicated after Sarah died, very sadly in 1876, much too young, Blanche became one of his most important correspondents, and he talked to her about family matters, but he also talked to her about politics. And when Blanche was getting ready to marry her husband, Adelbert Ames, there's a wonderful correspondence between the two of them where she says, "Oh, Adelbert, I hope you're not expecting me to say I'm going to obey you in our wedding vows." And Adelbert says, "Oh, no, I just want you to love me," But he raised strong women, and he believed that women should be strong. So he was very supportive of them because of the world from which he came and the people he knew.
If there's something that comes clear through this book, is that he does have a bedrock philosophy in life. He's really standing up for the underdog all the time. African Americans, women, laboring classes, and the forces of political power are aligned against that. He's not a very popular guy for the causes he champions.
Right. I thought you were going to move in the direction of saying, but what about the Chinese?
Yes, that's the one inconsistency, which you point out.
Yeah, because he does seem to be and he supports immigrants, and he supports Catholics, and he supports Irish, he supports women, and he supports Blacks, and he supports laboring people, and he supports the poor. But he really struggles with this issue of what to do about the Chinese immigrant laborers who are arriving to work on the railroads and so on. And that became a very hot button issue in the post-war period. I can't defend him on this front. And I don't think he defends himself very well. I think it was an issue. He did say that he would have said, and he tried to say, I think, that his failure to outright defend the Chinese laborers was not because they were Chinese. So it wasn't racist, in other words. It's because they were forced laborers. Because they were being brought over forcibly. If they were free laborers making the choice to come to America, then they would be like, that was the argument he made. Seems a little squishy to me. Again, not an apology for him or a defense of him, but let's face it, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, nobody was watching out for the Chinese laborers. And the Chinese Exclusion Act is the work of the Republican Party. James Blaine of Maine, crucial figure, very important Republican figure, crucial figure in the passage of that bill. So Republican Party generally, a party of emancipation, really falls down on the case of the Chinese laborers. And Butler, I can't defend him there.
Right, and he is not loyal to a single party. He changes, but his bedrock philosophy remains basically the same.
He sort of goes, I read I think it was something I read, yes, that where somebody had said on some social media site, he was like a weirdo who had no political foundation whatsoever. It's not a direct quote, but the weirdo part was, and I remember thinking, Butler would probably enjoy it if you called him a weirdo. I'm insulted by it, but he would probably think it's funny. But I would disagree with that vehemently and say he had very clear politics, but the parties did shift. And he kept looking for his political home, and he didn't really feel loyal. After his early days of being pretty loyal to the Democratic Party, he gave that up. He was like, where is the party that represents the values that I have? That's the party I want to stick with. And by the end, he's sort of with the Greenback anti-monopoly party and sort of a semi-Democrat again and so on. So, but he did have these bedrock values, and he didn't have a home for them particularly. And then he kind of throws up his hands and says, it's not going to work. It's just not going to happen.
Let's talk real quick about reconciliation, the process of Northerners and Southerners coming back together. I was surprised to learn that Butler, for his reputation as being this champion of, the Union was right and secession was wrong, picked as his law partner a former Confederate general, Roger Pryor.
Right. One of his many law partners, but an important one. And it is an interesting question, and I'm not sure that I can explain that real well either, except it is true that Pryor moved to New York, and left the South behind himself. And I don't think Butler felt strongly I'm sure that he didn't feel strongly, once an enemy, always an enemy. And he made that clear in a number of ways. In fact, he said at one point, and I'm not going to be able to say it quite right, but something like, if my former enemies know how fiercely I fought against them, they must know how fiercely I will stand with them should they come round, to sense. And I think he meant that sincerely. So I think he was open to the idea of reconciliation, absolutely. He did not want an ongoing civil war in the United States. Where he absolutely drew the line was that reconciliation between the sections or among whites in America must not be at the expense of the freed people. So if you're going to throw the freed people under the bus, I'm not interested in that kind of reconciliation. And of course, a sure sign that he wasn't just ready. I mean, he moved forward or moved, he changed like the nation changed, but not nearly as fast. And the impeachment of Andrew Johnson is a sure indication that he wasn't interested in reconciliation quite that early,
Yeah. I'll do one more question. We could talk all night, but I'm going to do one more. I want to get audience reactions here. What did he think history would remember? How do you think history, or what did he think history was going to think of him? Did he care about his reputation?
I I was thinking about that question because you graciously sent that to me in advance. And I was thinking that he both cared and didn't care about his reputation, which was so Butler. Yes and no. You know, I care about it. I mean, you don't write a 1,000-page autobiography for the kicks, you know. He cared to correct the record, and he hoped that the good that he had done would be recognized. And certainly many of his friends and allies through his life ensured him, your name is being written on tablets, you know, like the name of God, like the, you know, you will be remembered in history in this way for these things that you are doing. He knew better because, of course, he also knew he had a lot of enemies. He cared about his reputation, but once he wrote that book, he sent it out into the world. He gathered with his family. He went about his work and he let it go. So I in that sense, I think my guess is he would probably have expected that negative thoughts about him would fade sooner than now, you know. Recognition would come sooner than maybe now of the positive things he contributed. And if you look at his funeral, which is, as I was telling someone earlier, I actually thought about starting the book with his funeral because it's a wonderful moment to see how at the end of his life, over 100 years ago, the massive outpouring of love, support, respect for this man. We can't even imagine it today because so many people don't even know who he is. You know, he was so respected and beloved by so many people, certainly not by everybody. But, you know, of course, he would have loved it if that had continued forever. He would have loved it if Colby was not named Colby, but was named Butler College. And Colby College was originally Waterville College. It became Colby College because during the war, it struggled financially. And some guy with the last name Colby came to Colby, gave them $50,000, and that was enough to save the college. Imagine that, $50,000. So they named it Colby College, and there's a letter from Butler going, Yeah, I think he resented that. So he would have loved it to be recognized in much more positive ways. I think he might have expected it. Certainly a lot of people said, you know, this is how you will be remembered. But he was not a fool, and he was wise to how many people hated him. And I think he basically figured, you do what you do, you do the best you can, you try to, you know, defend yourself. But he was not interested in defending every attack that came his way. He, in fact, spoke to that and said, you know, what is the point of that? Because then if I don't address a particular attack, people will say, oh, well, he's guilty on that one. You know, so he just sort of would have let it go. But I think he'd like this book. I think he'd love this cover, which I love, and I love it. And I just want to say this is a very unusual picture of him. The actual image of him is inside of the book. And the designers at UNC Press, you know, obviously did some work with the coloring and so on. But it's based on an actual photograph of him that his daughter, Blanche, didn't like because she didn't like the beard. And she said, tell Dad to get rid of the beard. I'm not going to kiss him with the beard. But what I like about it is that if he's instantly recognizable to anybody who's ever seen Butler before, I think. Although someone said he looks like Ulysses Grant.
No.
I didn't see it either. But anyway, but it's also like, wow, I've never seen him that way before. And that's exactly how I think the book operates. You think you know him, lot to be seen in here that will be familiar, and then you'll go, well, I didn't know that. So the cover is a beautiful design. I had nothing to do with it. That's why I can say that.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank
Let's
you.
see what the audience members have.
Great questions. Yes.
Hey, sorry.
Somebody
First of
else.
all, thank you so much. Amazing talk. I know Butler got his start defending the mill girls in Lowell, and I just was wondering if you could expand on some of the arguments that he made in defense of those workers.
Well, I have to admit, I haven't looked carefully into the, oh, you disappeared. There you are. I haven't looked carefully into the cases specifically, but I know that the issues were often around wages that were withheld for various reasons. So I'm sure he would have gone in and talked about the legitimacy of withholding wages and so on, or the kinds of hours that were being expected and so on. But I haven't done a deep dive into those cases. I apologize.
Thank you for the talk. I really look forward to reading the book. I have a historical memory question. You talked about his marginalization, I think, in really helpful ways. And it makes sense to me that he wasn't strong tactically in the battlefield, the lost cause, ideology, the fact that he didn't sort of look like he was at a central casting. Those all make sense. But I also wonder if this same kind of phenomenon that you're calling Butler Gump also kind of worked against him, right? Like, he wasn't known for one issue, right? He wasn't known for one event. He's everywhere. He has that foundation, like you say, but he has this long life that is in support of a lot of causes. He's so many places in the war that it's sort of like hard to create like a very solid, simplified narrative, right? Which I'm curious to see in the book, because I'm sure you had to cover a lot of ground. So it's just a sort of a thought that maybe that's a factor as well, that, you know, because you were talking about like, we didn't live, like, unlike Sumner, who died early in Reconstruction, you know, but there are other figures like, you know, Sumner dies, Reconstruction isn't over, but radicalism is pretty much, you know, not what it was, and yet he's, you know, lionized as champion of Black equality and abolitionism because he was more of like a single issue kind of figure. So just sort of a thought.
Yeah, I suppose that's possible, but I still think it's so strange that as someone who was everywhere, I mean, including, he was part of the defense of the Haymarket bombers, you know, one of his last major cases. I mean, he was throughout the century so important. Yeah, I don't know if that would work against him in terms of a positive view. It is hard to tell his story, but it's hard to tell any life story, I think. I was thinking about that whole issue today too, actually, as I was driving down here. I was thinking I think you had a question that you had posed to me in an email about biographies and this biography and another biography. And I was thinking biographies they're inherently straight. I mean, there's a narrative arc, which is so helpful, you know, starts at birth, ends at death. So helpful in terms of organizing the material, which you don't always have, you know. But I mean, if I had to write my autobiography, oh, please don't. I mean, there's so much I don't remember. It's so chaotic. I don't know why I do certain things, why I've done certain things. And I think any life is like that. And war is like that. Historians are always trying to make clear outlines and, you know, clear stories about things that are totally chaotic and hard to understand. So it's possible that because he did so many different things that, you know, made it hard for people but people did write biographies of him, and some of them are just dreadful. They're dreadful and they're mean. And I tell you, if I have to see someone else talk about cross-eyed Butler, I'm going to lose my nut, as they say in some places. And I made a point. I mention his droopy eyes, and he does have surgery later in his life. He had strabismus, you know, this wandering eyes and these droopy eyelids. But I was very careful about how I handled his appearance, because I thought, God, I'm just so sick of that, that it was like something important to include in, you know, over and over and over again, as if that's who he was. He was cross-eyed, and that's what made him, you know, who he was. Just so annoying.
So starting from the narrative, just a couple of observations quickly. His lack of sympathy in the Chinese exclusion situation kind of reflects his pre-war lack of sympathy for the blacks of the South. And if you got to know them, he would defend them. That's somewhat myopic, that's very human.
I think that's possible. Yep.
And
that's a good point.
secondly, I'm fascinated by the guy, and we haven't even touched the graft, but he is somewhat self-made. I guess he married well, but he made a lot of that. He was a very successful trial lawyer. Like Lincoln, he's just a lawyer, no special training for administration. And although we talk about the sophistication of his arguments in the contraband issue, he just comes in, it's very admirable, very masculine, if you will, to come in and see what needs to be done, does it, and hang the consequences. And what he did in New Orleans was like, not because he hated them, but it's shock and awe. In Baltimore, my God, to think that the federal government is surrounded and, you vote succession, we'll hang you. Very commanding personality. And then he was not a hell fellow well met. He didn't care. I mean, we didn't even touch on his post-war, all the people in Massachusetts power who hated him. So, a man is known by his enemies, among other things. So anyway, not a question, just an observation.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point, though, about had he had more direct experience with Chinese laborers, that might well have changed how he saw things. I don't know. We don't know because we don't have that data. But certainly he was in good company, not standing up for them.
So we have a few questions online. Jay says, thanks for a great presentation, engaging, but on the subject of New Orleans, didn't his infamous order involve authorizing Union soldiers to have their way with any insurrectionary women?
No, it did not.
Okay.
It of course was portrayed that way, as if to say, in the same way that, well, if we free the slaves, they'll rape white women. Freeing the slaves means giving them permission. It's the same argument, giving them permission to do these terrible things. No, the woman order was about throwing women in jail.
And Liza asks, can you talk a bit about Butler's association with the Democratic Party?
Well, when exactly? Because he came and went. I mean, he began as a Democrat. Early on, he saw himself as he said a Jeffersonian Democrat. I think, he became more of a Jacksonian Democrat in terms of the chronology. But then he became a Republican. Then he went back to the Democratic Party. And then he sort of became a freelancer, frustrated with both of the major parties, and so on. So he had a complicated relationship with political party, period. And at one point later in his life, he was contemplating with others forming another party, the People's Party, and that was not successful, but he did feel that he was laying the foundation for that, and his son-in-law, Adelbert, was interested in that as well. So, yeah, he was a Democrat, but he didn't remain a Democrat, and he really didn't have that sense of loyalty to a particular party, particularly after 1860. Is something going to happen that the bell rang?
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, very excited to read the book. Great talk. I just got 2 quick questions about things I've read about Butler, but I haven't been able to confirm. The first is with how he prevented Maryland from seceding. Did he really seize the seal of the state?
I believe that he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's always fun. And then the second one is I read that he was tapped by Lincoln's team to be vice president before Johnson, and that his response was that because he wanted to continue making money as a lawyer, was that unless he promised to die in the first 3 months, he wouldn't take the job.
Yes, I think this story is endlessly repeated.
Yes.
And I think it's not true. For a variety of reasons. An important one is I have never seen archival evidence to that effect anywhere. Number 2, or should it be B? I can't remember how I started my outline. But anyway, another reason is that in his, did I say massive autobiography, he never mentions it. And you got to believe he would have if Lincoln had asked him to be vice president. He might not have given the quote about, you have to die first, but he would have said, oh, and Lincoln, but he doesn't mention it there. So I have seen that, but I think that's one of those stories that just gets out in the world and, and maybe part of it is yearning too. I've seen quite a bit of talk recently on Twitter, one of the few social media platforms I actually like and I'm on, about wouldn't it have been better if Butler was in charge of Reconstruction, and a kind of yearning for him to have been Lincoln's VP. And frankly, yeah, but Too bad we got stuck with Johnson instead.
I'll just stand up and face you. I am the proud owner of a Butler chamber pot. I very much regret not thinking of it to bring here for you, in which case that I would insist that you do not use as directed. But I have a quick question for you about the lost cause myth, which you mentioned and is covered in your book too. It has been so pernicious in American history that we now have chunks of the population saying they want a civil war, and when a civil war is the worst possible war, always, it seems, in a nation's history. So I see your book as an instrument in the struggle against people who want another civil war, and we need your kind of book and others too.
Well,
thanks very much.
That's so kind. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and I'm happy to stay and sign books or as long as I'm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.